In the harsh winter of 1847, when the wind cut through flesh like a blade and snow fell thick enough to bury a horse, a young woman named Sarah Mitchell made a choice that would either save her life or end it. With her shoes stolen by raiders and frostbite already claiming her toes, she stepped into the endless white wilderness, wearing nothing but torn cotton on her feet. Behind her lay a burned settlement and the bodies of everyone she had ever loved. Ahead stretched hundreds of miles of unforgiving terrain, where death waited in every shadow, and survival meant becoming something she never thought possible. But Sarah Mitchell didn't know that her bare feet would lead her straight into the path of an Apache warrior whose own story of loss would intertwine with hers in ways that would challenge everything both their peoples believed about enemies, survival, and the thin line between hatred and salvation. This is the story of two souls who found each other in the wasteland between worlds, where the only law was survival and the only warmth came from the most unexpected source. Sarah Mitchell had always believed that God tested people according to their strength, but as she pressed her bleeding feet into the snow for the 1,000th time that morning, she wondered if perhaps God had overestimated her. The cold had long since stopped feeling like cold. Now it felt like fire, like tiny knives cutting through her bones, like the memory of warmth that made her want to weep. 3 days had passed since the raiders came to Millfield Settlement. 3 days since she had watched her father die defending their small cabin. Since she had seen her mother dragged away screaming. Since she had hidden in the root cellar while boots tramped overhead and voices spoke in languages she didn't understand. When silence finally came, she had emerged to find nothing but ash, blood, and the terrible stillness that follows devastation. The raiders had taken everything of value, including the shoes from every corpse they could find. Sarah had searched desperately through the ruins, hoping to find even a pair of men's boots that might protect her feet. But they had been thorough in their pillaging. She had wrapped her feet in strips torn from her mother's quilt, but the thin cotton had disintegrated within hours of walking through the snow and ice. Now she moved like a ghost across the white landscape, leaving drops of blood in her wake that froze before they could sink into the snow. Her destination was Fort Morrison, a military outpost that her father had mentioned lay somewhere to the southwest. He had never given her specific directions, had never imagined his 22-year-old daughter would meet to find it alone. But it was the only hope she had of finding civilization before the cold claimed her completely. The landscape around her was both beautiful and merciless. Rolling hills covered in pristine snow stretched endlessly in every direction, broken only by the occasional stand of bare trees that offered little shelter from the wind. The sky was the color of old pewter, heavy with the promise of more snow to come. Sarah had grown up on stories of the frontier, tales of brave settlers carving homes from the wilderness, but those stories had never mentioned how vast the emptiness could feel, how the silence could press against you like a living thing. She had started the journey with supplies salvaged from what remained of her family's cabin: a small bag of cornmeal, a knife with a broken handle, a tin cup, and her father's worn Bible had seemed like enough to sustain her for the few days she imagined the journey would take. But she had underestimated both the distance and the toll the cold would take on her body. The cornmeal was already half gone, mixed with snow and eaten raw because she had no way to build a fire that wouldn't be seen for miles. The first night, she had tried to sleep beneath a fallen log, piling snow around herself for insulation the way her father had taught her. But the cold had penetrated every layer of her clothing, and she had spent the dark hours shivering so violently that she feared her teeth might crack. By dawn, she had realized that stopping for extended rest would mean death. Since then, she had allowed herself only brief moments of rest, leaning against trees or rocks before forcing herself to continue moving. Her feet had become her greatest enemy. The skin had cracked and split within hours of beginning her journey, and now each step sent sharp pain shooting up her legs. She had tried walking on the sides of her feet, on her heels, even briefly on her knees, but nothing provided real relief. The worst part was that she could no longer feel her toes at all. When she had looked at them during her brief rest that morning, they had been white and waxy, clearly frostbitten beyond saving. But it was not just the physical pain that threatened to break her. The memories came without warning, washing over her like waves. Her mother's voice singing hymns while she kneaded bread. Her father's laugh when he caught a particularly large fish in the creek behind their cabin. The way her little brother Timothy had looked when he concentrated on his letters, his tongue poking out between his teeth. Timothy had been only 8 years old, and she had found his body curled under his small bed where he had tried to hide. Sarah forced herself to push these memories away. She had learned over the past 3 days that grief was a luxury she couldn't afford. Grief slowed her steps and clouded her thinking, and out here, both could kill her. Instead, she focused on the immediate tasks of survival. Place one foot in front of the other, watch for signs of shelter. Listen for sounds that might indicate water or danger. Keep moving. The sun, what little of it filtered through the clouds, told her it was past midday when she saw the smoke. At first, she thought it might be her imagination, a cruel trick played by exhaustion and desperation. But as she crested a small hill, she could clearly see the thin grey line rising from a valley below. Her heart began to race, and she quickened her pace despite the increased pain in her feet. As she drew closer, she could make out the source of the smoke. A small camp was nestled in a grove of cottonwood trees beside a partially frozen stream. She could see the shapes of several horses tethered nearby, and what appeared to be temporary shelters made from branches and animal hides. Her first instinct was relief, the desperate joy of finding other human beings in this vast emptiness. But as she moved closer, caution began to override hope. The camp didn't look like anything she was familiar with. These weren't the canvas tents and wooden structures she associated with military outposts or trading posts. The shelters were low and rounded, and she could see that the horses wore different tack than what she was accustomed to seeing on the mounts of cavalry soldiers or settlers. Sarah crouched behind a boulder about 50 yards from the camp, trying to gather information before revealing herself. She could see figures moving around the fire, but they were too far away for her to make out details. The smart thing would be to circle around the camp and continue toward Fort Morrison. These could be more raiders, or hostile Indians, or any number of dangers that a lone woman should avoid. But the smoke from their fire carried the smell of cooking meat, and her stomach cramped with hunger so intense it made her dizzy. She hadn't eaten anything but snow and raw cornmeal for 2 days, and the scent of food was almost overwhelming. More importantly, she could see that several of the figures around the fire appeared to be tending to someone who was lying on the ground near the flames. If these people were caring for an injured companion, perhaps they weren't the kind of people who would harm a desperate traveler. The decision was made for her when her numbed feet finally betrayed her. She shifted her weight to get a better view of the camp, and her left foot, which she could no longer feel, failed to find purchase on the icy rock. She tumbled forward, sending a cascade of small stones clattering down the hillside. The sound echoed across the valley like gunshots. Instantly, the camp below erupted into activity. Figures scattered from around the fire, and she could hear voices calling out in a language she didn't recognize. Within seconds, she found herself looking down the length of a rifle barrel, held by a man who had approached her position with a silence that seemed impossible given the noise she had just made. The man holding the rifle was unlike anyone Sarah had ever seen. His skin was dark bronze, weathered by sun and wind, and his black hair hung loose to his shoulders except for 2 braids that framed his face. He wore a mixture of traditional Indian clothing and items clearly taken from white settlements, buckskin pants and shirt, but also a wool coat that had probably once belonged to a cavalry officer. His dark eyes were steady and alert as they studied her, showing no emotion that she could read. For a long moment, they stared at each other across the space between the rock and the rifle barrel. Sarah found herself thinking, with the strange clarity that sometimes comes in moments of extreme danger, that he was younger than she had expected. Perhaps no more than 25 or 30 years old. There were no lines of cruelty around his eyes, no signs of the casual brutality she had learned to associate with raiders and outlaws. "Please," she whispered, the word coming out as barely more than a breath in the cold air. "I'm not armed. I'm alone." The man tilted his head slightly, and she realized that he might not understand English. She raised her hands slowly, showing that they were empty, and tried to make her voice stronger. "I need help. My family is dead. I'm trying to reach Fort Morrison." At the mention of the fort, something changed in the man's expression. His grip on the rifle tightened slightly, and his eyes narrowed. He called out something in his own language to the people below, and she heard answering calls from the camp. Within minutes, 2 more men had joined him, moving up the hillside with the same impossible silence. These men were clearly warriors, and Sarah felt her heart sink as she recognized the war paint on their faces and the weapons they carried. But as her eyes moved over them, she noticed something that gave her pause. One of the men carried a bundle that looked like medical supplies, and all 3 of them kept glancing back toward the camp with expressions of concern rather than aggression. The first man, who seemed to be their leader, spoke to his companions in rapid, low tones. Then he looked back at Sarah and said something in halting English. "You, sick, hurt?" His accent was thick, and she had to concentrate to understand the words. But the fact that he was attempting to communicate in her language gave her hope. She gestured toward her feet, which were leaving small red stains on the white rock where she crouched. "My feet?" she said. "Frostbite. I've been walking for 3 days." My family was killed by raiders. I have nothing. The man studied her for a long moment, then said something to his companions. One of them descended back toward the camp, while the other remained on guard. The leader lowered his rifle slightly, though he kept it ready, and took a step closer to examine her. What he saw clearly shocked him. Sarah knew she must look like a spectre, pale and gaunt from hunger and exposure, her dress torn and stained with blood and dirt. Her hair hung in tangled strands around her face, and her lips were cracked and blue from the cold. But it was her feet that drew his attention. Even from several feet away, he could see the extent of the damage the cold had done. He spoke sharply to his remaining companion, who immediately started down the hill toward the camp. Then the leader slung his rifle over his shoulder and approached Sarah with his hands visible and empty. When he was close enough to touch her, he crouched down and gestured toward her feet. "Look?" he asked. Sarah nodded, too exhausted and cold to maintain her fear. She extended one foot toward him, and he examined it with the careful attention of someone who understood the seriousness of frostbite. His face remained impassive, but she saw his jaw tighten when he took in the extent of the damage. He stood and looked back toward the camp, then at her face. For a moment she thought he was going to leave her there, that whatever discussion was happening in his mind had concluded that she was too much trouble, or too far gone to help. But then he spoke again, this time with more urgency. "Come." "Fire. Medicine." He gestured toward the camp below, but when Sarah tried to stand, her legs buckled beneath her. The combination of exhaustion, hunger, and blood loss had finally overwhelmed her body's ability to function. She felt herself falling forward, and the last thing she remembered was strong arms catching her before she hit the rocky ground. When consciousness returned, she was lying on something soft and warm, and she could feel heat against her face. Her first thought was that she had died and was experiencing some version of paradise, because after 3 days of unrelenting cold, the sensation of warmth felt too good to be real. But as her senses cleared, she realized she was lying on furs beside a fire, and the warmth came from both the flames and the heavy blanket that had been wrapped around her. She tried to sit up, and immediately felt a gentle but firm hand on her shoulder, pressing her back down. "Rest," said a voice in accented English. "Feet bad. Need medicine." Sarah turned her head and found herself looking into the same dark eyes that had regarded her over the rifle barrel. But now, instead of suspicion and wariness, she saw something that looked almost like kindness. The man was kneeling beside her, and she could see that he had changed from his warrior's clothing into simpler garments. Soft buckskin shirt and pants that looked much warmer than anything she had worn in days. "Where am I?" she whispered. "Safe," he replied. "My people help. Give medicine, food." As if summoned by the mention of food, another figure appeared beside the fire. This was an older woman, her grey hair braided with small shells and beads, her face lined with years of sun and weather. She carried a wooden bowl that steamed in the cold air, and the smell that rose from it made Sarah's stomach clench with desperate hunger. The woman spoke to the man in their shared language, and he nodded before turning back to Sarah. "Grandmother say eat slow. Sick if eat fast." Sarah accepted the bowl with shaking hands and found it contained a rich broth with small pieces of meat and what might have been wild onions. The first sip sent warmth flooding through her body, and she had to force herself to follow the old woman's advice and eat slowly, despite her body's screaming demand for nourishment. As she ate, she became aware of the activity around the camp. There were perhaps 6 or 7 people moving around the fire, all dressed in the practical clothing of people who lived close to the land. Some tended to weapons and equipment, while others worked on what appeared to be preparations for travel, but none of them showed the casual brutality or predatory behavior she had learned to associate with the raiders who had destroyed her settlement. "Are you Apache?" she asked the man who had been watching her eat. He nodded. "Chiricahua, Apache. I am Nalish." He gestured toward the old woman. "Grandmother is Desba. She medicine woman." Sarah had grown up hearing stories about Apache warriors, tales that painted them as savage and merciless fighters who showed no mercy to white settlers. But the reality of her situation seemed to contradict everything she had been taught. These people had taken her in when she was dying, given her warmth and food and medical care without asking for anything in return. "Why are you helping me?" she asked. Nalinish was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of sadness that seemed at odds with his youth. "My sister," he said slowly. "Raiders kill her, take her children. She tried to walk home, die in snow, no shoes." He looked at Sarah's face. "You have sister's eyes. Same brave, same stubborn. The old woman, Desba, had been working on something beside the fire while they talked. Now she approached with what appeared to be a collection of herbs and soft leather strips. She spoke to Nolnish, who translated. Grandmother say your feet very bad. Some toes may be gone, but she can save rest, if you let her work. Sarah nodded, though the prospect of medical treatment from someone whose method she didn't understand was frightening. But she had seen enough death over the past few days to recognize that without help, her feet would continue to deteriorate until infection or gangrene claimed them entirely. Desba's treatment was unlike anything Sarah had experienced. The old woman began by carefully cleaning her feet with warm water that had been infused with herbs that smelled of pine and sage. The pain was intense when feeling began to return to areas that had been completely numb, but Desba's touch was gentle and sure. As the medicine woman worked, she spoke continuously in Apache, and though Sarah couldn't understand the words, the rhythm of her voice was soothing, almost like a lullaby. Narlinch sat nearby, sometimes translating when Desba asked him to explain something to their patient. She say the damage is bad, but not worst she has seen. He told Sarah as Desba applied what looked like a paste made from ground plants to the worst areas of frostbite. She can save 7 toes, maybe 8. The others, he shrugged, already dead. Better to let them go before bad spirits spread. The idea of losing toes was terrifying, but Sarah had already suspected that the 2 smallest toes on her left foot were beyond saving. The fact that this woman believed she could save the rest felt like a miracle. As Desba worked, wrapping her feet in soft leather and fur that would protect them while allowing them to breathe, Sarah found herself studying the camp around her. What she saw challenged many of her preconceptions about Indian life. The people here were clearly skilled and organized, their equipment well maintained, and their camp efficiently arranged. The weapons, she could see, were of excellent quality, many of them clearly taken from military sources, but adapted and improved upon. How long have you been traveling? She asked Nalnish. His expression darkened. 6 months, maybe 7. Soldiers burn our village, kill many people. We look for new place, safe place. I'm sorry, Sarah said, and meant it. The pain in his voice was something she recognized from her own recent loss. War is hard for everyone, Nalnish replied. Apache, white people, Mexican people. Everyone lose family, lose home. When Desba finished with her feet, she moved on to examining the rest of Sarah's body for signs of frostbite or injury. She found minor frostbite on Sarah's fingers and ears, but nothing as serious as the damage to her feet. Throughout the examination, she maintained a professional distance, but Sarah could see genuine concern in the old woman's eyes. As evening approached and the temperature began to drop, the Apache began making preparations for the night. Sarah watched as they efficiently banked their fire to provide maximum warmth with minimum visibility, arranged their sleeping areas to take advantage of natural windbreaks, and posted guards to watch the approaches to their camp. Do you expect trouble? Sarah asked Nalnish as he helped her move closer to the fire. Always expect trouble, he replied. Army patrols, other tribes, raiders like those who kill your family. Safe place not exist anymore. They gave her more food as darkness fell, a stew made from dried meat and wild plants that was more nourishing than anything she had eaten in weeks, even before her family's death. The combination of warmth, food, and medical care was already having an effect on her body, and she could feel strength beginning to return to her limbs. But as she lay wrapped in the heavy blanket that Nalnish had provided, staring up at stars that seemed impossibly bright in the clear cold air, Sarah found herself facing a dilemma she hadn't expected. These people had saved her life, shown her kindness when she had every reason to expect hostility. But they were also the enemies of her people, warriors who had undoubtedly fought against the army, and quite possibly against settlers like her family. Moreover, staying with them would mean abandoning her plans to reach Fort Morrison and the safety of military protection. It would mean entering a world completely different from anything she had ever known, where the rules of survival were unlike anything she had been taught. But the alternative was to leave this warmth and protection and venture back into the wilderness alone, with damaged feet and no supplies, hoping to cover hundreds of miles of hostile territory to reach a destination that might not even exist. As she wrestled with these thoughts, she became aware that Nalnish was sitting by the fire, apparently keeping watch but also working on something in his lap. In the flickering light, she could see that he was carefully sewing what appeared to be pieces of soft leather, creating something with the patient skill of someone who had made many similar items. "What are you making?" she asked softly. He looked up, seeming surprised that she was still awake. "Moccasins," he said, holding up his work so she could see. "For you. Cannot walk in snow with no shoes." The simple kindness of the gesture brought tears to her eyes. This man, who had every reason to see her as an enemy, was spending his evening creating footwear that might save her life. It was a level of thoughtful care that she had rarely experienced even among her own people. Sarah woke to the sound of low voices speaking in Apache, and the smell of pine smoke mixed with something that reminded her of her mother's herb garden. The sky above was still dark, but she could see the first pale hints of dawn touching the eastern horizon. Around her, the camp was already stirring, with people moving quietly through their morning routines with the efficiency of those who had learned to pack and move quickly. Her feet, wrapped in Desba's careful bandages, felt different than they had in days. There was still pain, but it was a clean, healing pain rather than the dull agony of dying tissue. She flexed her toes experimentally and was relieved to find that most of them responded, though 2 on her left foot remained completely numb. Nalinish appeared beside her with a wooden bowl containing what looked like a tea made from bark and dried berries. "Drink," he said. "Grandmother say help with pain, help healing." The tea was bitter but warming, and Sarah was grateful for both the liquid and the heat it provided. As she drank, she watched the Apache breaking down their camp with remarkable speed and organization. Every person, from children who looked no more than 10 years old to elders like Desba, had specific tasks and carried them out without need for instruction or supervision. "Are we leaving?" she asked. Nolish nodded. "Storm coming. Need shelter before snow starts." He gestured towards the northwestern sky, where dark clouds were building along the horizon. "No place, 2 days' travel. Safe place." The prospect of traveling 2 days through the wilderness, even with help, was daunting, but Sarah understood that staying in their current exposed location would be dangerous for everyone. She also realized that if she was going to leave this group and continue toward Fort Morrison, now would be the time to say so. But as she opened her mouth to speak, Desba appeared with the moccasins that Nalnish had been working on the night before. The old woman knelt beside her and began carefully fitting them over her bandaged feet. The moccasins were works of art as much as practical footwear, made from soft deer hide and lined with rabbit fur. They were designed to accommodate the bulky bandages while still providing protection and warmth. When Desba finished, she spoke to Sarah in Apache, her voice serious and intent. Nalnish translated, "Grandmother say you not ready for long journey alone. Feet need many days to heal. She say you come with us, help us, we help you. When spring comes, when feet strong, then you choose your path." It was a generous offer, perhaps more generous than Sarah deserved, given that she represented a people who had been at war with the Apache for decades. But she also understood that accepting it would mean committing herself to a way of life completely foreign to everything she had known. "What would I do?" she asked. "How could I help? I don't know how to live like this." Nalnish smiled, the first genuine smile she had seen from him. "You learn. Apache children learn, white children can learn too. You help with work, we teach you what you need to know." Before Sarah could answer, one of the other warriors approached and spoke urgently to Nalnish. She couldn't understand the words, but the tone was clearly one of concern. Nalnish's expression became serious, and he stood quickly scanning the surrounding hills. "What is it?" Sarah asked. "Tracks," Nalnish replied tersely. "Horses, many horses, heading this direction. Maybe cavalry, maybe raiders. Either way, not good for us." The camp transformed instantly from a place of quiet morning activity to one of urgent preparation for flight. The Apache moved with practiced efficiency, packing essential items and abandoning anything that would slow them down. Sarah found herself sitting helplessly, unable to contribute to the effort but unwilling to be left behind. Desba appeared at her side with a travel pack that looked like it had been prepared specifically for her. The old woman helped her stand and tested her ability to walk in the new moccasins. Sarah's first steps were painful and uncertain, but the footwear provided enough protection and support that she could move without leaving bloody tracks. Within minutes, the camp had been completely dismantled, leaving only faint traces that someone had been there. The Apache mounted their horses, with Desba gesturing for Sarah to climb up behind Nalnish. It was the first time she had been on horseback since she was a child, and the motion was disorienting after days of traveling on foot. They rode hard for several hours, following game trails and dry creek beds that provided cover from observation. Nalnish and the other warriors frequently stopped to check their back trail and study the horizon for signs of pursuit. Sarah could feel the tension in the group, the constant awareness that discovery could mean death for all of them. Around midday, they stopped in a canyon that provided natural concealment and allowed their horses to rest and drink from a small spring. Sarah was grateful for the break, as her body was not accustomed to long hours on horseback, but she could see that the Apache was still alert for danger. "Who do you think was following us?" she asked Nalnish as he helped her down from the horse. "Hard to say," he replied, scanning the canyon entrance. "Army patrol, maybe. Or could be bounty hunters. Government pay good money for Apache scalps, dead or alive." The casual way he mentioned bounty hunters shocked Sarah. She had heard rumors of such men, but the idea that people would hunt other human beings for money was almost incomprehensible to her. "That's barbaric," she said. Nalnish gave her a look that was neither angry nor mocking, just sad. "War make people do barbaric things. Apache take scalps too sometimes. White people take Apache children, sell them as slaves. Everyone becomes something they never wanted to be." During their rest stop, Sarah observed more of the group dynamics that she had missed in the urgency of the morning. There were 8 Apache in total, including herself and Nalnish. Besides Desba, there was another older man who seemed to be some kind of leader or elder, 2 younger warriors, and 3 women, one of whom was clearly pregnant. The pregnant woman, who looked to be about Sarah's age, watched her with particular interest. When their eyes met, the woman smiled and said something in Apache that sounded friendly. Nalnish translated. "She say welcome. Her name is Ayana. She ask if you have children." "No," Sarah replied. "I was never married." When Nalnish relayed this, Ayana nodded sympathetically and spoke again. "She say that is good, maybe." Nalnish translated with some reluctance. "Children make traveling hard, make running from soldiers hard. Better to be free when world is dangerous." As they prepared to resume their journey, Sarah found herself paired with Ayana for the afternoon's ride. The pregnant woman spoke no English, but she was patient and kind as she tried to teach Sarah some basic Apache words. By the time they stopped for the evening, Sarah could say, "Thank you," water, horse, and danger in the Apache language. Their destination proved to be a hidden valley, accessible only through a narrow passage between towering rock walls. The valley contained a small lake fed by underground springs, and the surrounding cliffs provided natural shelter from wind and observation. Best of all, there were caves in the rock walls that could provide refuge from the worst weather. As evening approached and the promised storm began to arrive, Sarah found herself helping to gather firewood and prepare the evening meal. The work was different from anything she had done before, but the other women were patient teachers who showed her how to identify the best wood for burning and how to prepare wild plants that she had never seen before. The storm hit just as they finished setting up their shelters in one of the larger caves. Snow began falling heavily, driven by winds that howled through the canyon entrance. Sarah sat by the fire, wrapped in the warm blanket that had become her constant companion, and watched the Apache settle in for what was clearly going to be a long, cold night. Nalnish joined her by the fire, and she noticed that he looked troubled. "What's wrong?" she asked. "Thinking about winter," he replied. "This storm is just beginning. Soon snow will be too deep for travel, too cold for hunting. We need to find winter camp soon, or we will all starve." "Don't you have a regular winter camp, a place you go every year?" Nalnish's expression grew darker. "Had winter camp. Army burn it last summer, kill everyone who stay behind. Now we have nowhere. Must find new place, but everywhere we go, someone already there, or soldiers come to drive us away." The magnitude of their situation began to dawn on Sarah. These people weren't just traveling, they were refugees, driven from their ancestral lands and searching desperately for somewhere they could survive the winter. Her own loss, devastating as it was the loss of one family. These people had lost their entire way of life. "What will you do?" she asked. "Keep looking," Nalnish said simply. "Keep moving until we find place that is safe, or until winter kills us all." That night, as the storm raged outside their cave and the temperature dropped well below freezing, Sarah lay awake thinking about her situation. She was warm and fed and surrounded by people who had shown her nothing but kindness. But she was also further from her own world than she had ever been. Every day she stayed with the Apache took her deeper into a life that her family and community would consider not just foreign but treacherous. Yet when she tried to imagine leaving, tried to picture herself announcing that she wanted to continue alone toward Fort Morrison, she found that the idea filled her with dread rather than hope. Not just because of the physical dangers, though those were real enough, but because she had begun to feel a sense of belonging here that surprised her. The next morning brought clear skies but bitter cold, with snow piled several feet deep outside their cave. The Apache spent the day resting, mending equipment, and telling stories around the fire. Sarah found herself included in these activities naturally, with various members of the group taking turns teaching her skills she would need to survive in their world. Desba showed her how to identify and prepare medicinal plants using a combination of gestures, drawings in the dirt, and simple English words that the old woman was slowly learning. One of the younger warriors, a man named Kasa, who couldn't have been much older than 20, taught her how to make and maintain a fire using materials that could be found in almost any environment. But it was Ayana who provided the most unexpected education. Despite her pregnancy, the young woman was clearly an expert in survival skills, and she spent hours showing Sarah how to prepare and preserve food, how to tan hides, and how to create clothing and equipment from natural materials. She was wife to my brother, Nalnish explained when Sarah asked about Ayana's obvious expertise. He was great hunter, great warrior. Killed by soldiers last spring. Now she carry his child, but also carry his knowledge. She teach you because she say you remind her of herself before she learn Apache ways. The revelation that Ayana was also a widow, also carrying the burden of recent loss, created an immediate bond between the two women that transcended language barriers. They spent much of the day working side by side, with Ayana patiently correcting Sarah's clumsy attempts at various tasks and Sarah providing extra hands for the work that was becoming difficult for the pregnant woman. On their third day in the Hidden Valley, scouts brought word that a large cavalry patrol was camped less than 10 miles away, apparently searching the area systematically. The news sent a ripple of tension through the group, and Sarah could see the fear in their eyes as they discussed their options. "Can't stay here," Nalnish told her, as they prepared to leave once again. "Too close to soldiers, and this place not secret anymore if they find tracks leading here." "Where will we go?" Sarah asked. "South," he replied. "Toward Mexico border. Maybe find other Apache bands. Maybe find place soldiers don't follow." The journey south began immediately. Despite the deep snow and bitter cold, Sarah found herself struggling to keep up even though she was riding rather than walking. The pace was relentless, driven by the knowledge that discovery would mean death or capture for the entire group. As they traveled, Sarah began to understand more about the dynamics of the group and their situation. The older man, whose name was Chato, was indeed a leader, but not in the way she had expected. Rather than giving orders, he seemed to guide the group through consensus and example. Decisions were made after discussion among all the adults, and even the children were consulted when their welfare was directly affected. The two younger warriors, Kasa and a man named Naichi, served as scouts and hunters, ranging ahead and behind the group, to watch for danger and search for game. Both were skilled horsemen and fighters, but Sarah was surprised to discover that they were also accomplished in peaceful arts. Kasa was an expert at reading weather signs and finding water, while Naiche had an encyclopedic knowledge of edible plants and their uses. The three women, besides Ayana, each had their own specialties. Desbo was obviously the medical expert and spiritual leader of the group. The other two, Ista and Nantan, were masters of practical skills like making clothing, preparing food, and creating the tools and equipment needed for survival on the trail. What struck Sarah most forcefully was how everyone in the group contributed according to their abilities and took only what they needed. There was no sense of hierarchy based on gender or age, no assumption that some work was more important than others. Ayana grew tired, others immediately took over her tasks without being asked. When Chato's arthritis made it difficult for him to mount his horse, Kasa and Naichi simply created a step from their interlaced hands without comment or ceremony. This cooperative approach extended to their treatment of Sarah as well. Despite the fact that she was essentially useless in most practical matters, slowing them down and consuming resources without contributing much in return, she was never made to feel unwelcome or burdensome. Instead, each person seemed to take it upon themselves to teach her something that would make her more capable and self-sufficient. After 4 days of hard travel, they reached a region where the snow was less deep and the terrain provided more opportunities for concealment. Chateau called a halt in a grove of ancient oak trees that provided both shelter and a commanding view of the surrounding country. "Rest here," Nalnish translated for Sarah. "Chateau say horses need rest, people need rest. Also, this is a place where other Apache bands sometimes come. Maybe we find friends, maybe get news." The prospect of meeting more Apache was both exciting and frightening for Sarah. She had grown comfortable with her current group, but the idea of being surrounded by even more people who had every reason to see her as an enemy was daunting. Her concerns proved to be unnecessary. Late on their second day in the oak grove, scouts announced the approach of another group of travelers. When they proved to be Apache, led by a woman named Lozan, who was apparently a famous warrior and medicine woman, Sarah's group welcomed them with obvious relief and joy. The meeting between the two groups was a revelation for Sarah. She watched as information was exchanged, not just about practical matters like the location of army patrols and the availability of winter camps, but about the welfare of friends and relatives scattered across the territory. It became clear that despite the efforts of the military to break up and isolate Apache bands, an extensive network of communication and mutual support continued to operate. Lawson herself was unlike any woman Sarah had ever met. Tall and lean, with eyes that seemed to miss nothing, she carried herself with the confidence of someone accustomed to command. Yet when she spoke with Sarah, her manner was neither hostile nor condescending. "You are the white woman Nalnish found in the snow," she said in excellent English. "He sent word ahead, ask what to do with you." Sarah felt her heart sink. "And what did they tell him?" Lawson studied her for a long moment, taking in everything from her Apache-made moccasins to the way she sat comfortably beside Nalnish's fire. "They say it is his decision. But they also say, white woman who can survive 10 days with Apache band without running away or causing trouble is maybe not ordinary white woman." That evening, as the two groups shared a meal and exchanged stories around a large fire, Sarah found herself the center of attention in a way that made her distinctly uncomfortable. Through Nalnish's translation, various members of Lawson's band asked her questions about her background, her family, and her reasons for staying with the Apache rather than seeking refuge with the army. Some of the questions were clearly tests, designed to determine whether she could be trusted or whether she was some kind of spy or scout for the military. Others seemed motivated by genuine curiosity about the white world and the motivations of the people who were trying to drive the Apache from their ancestral lands. "They want to understand," Nalnish explained to her privately. "Apache know white people want all Indian land, want all Indian people dead or on reservations. But they also know that not all white people are the same. Some white people help Apache, trade with Apache, even marry Apache. They try to understand what kind of white person you are." It was Lawson herself who asked the most difficult question, speaking to Sarah directly in her clear, precise English. "Your people and my people are at war. Your government offers money for Apache scalps. Your soldiers burn our villages and kill our children. Why do you stay with us instead of running to your own kind?" Sarah had been dreading this question since the night she had decided to stay with Nalnish's group. But now that it was asked directly, she found that the answer came easily. "Because these people saved my life when they could have let me die," she said. "Because they've shown me more kindness in 10 days than I received from some of my own neighbors in 20 years. Because the raiders who killed my family weren't Apache, but they weren't any different from the soldiers who've been killing Apache families. Evil isn't about what people look like or what language they speak. It's about what they choose to do to each other." Lawson listened to this answer without expression, then translated it for the others. The response was a murmur of approval from most of the listeners, though Sarah could see that some remained skeptical. "Good answer," Lawson said finally. "But words are easy. Anyone can say pretty words. Real test is what you do when choice is hard. When staying with Apache means choosing against your own people." As the evening wound down and the two groups prepared to separate the next morning, Sarah realized that this encounter had changed something fundamental about her situation. She was no longer just a refugee who had accidentally fallen in with a group of Apache. She was now a white woman who had chosen to stay with the Apache despite having opportunities to leave. That choice, and the implications of it, would follow her for the rest of her life. But as she lay wrapped in her blanket that night, listening to the quiet conversations around the dying fire, she found that the weight of that choice didn't frighten her as much as she had expected. Whatever lay ahead, she would face it with people who had proven their loyalty and kindness beyond any doubt. The parting with Lawson's band the next morning was bittersweet. Sarah had begun to hope that the two groups might travel together, providing safety in numbers. But she learned that Apache's survival strategy often required splitting into smaller, more mobile units that could disappear quickly when threatened. Lawson's people were heading east toward the mountains, while Nalnish's group would continue south toward the Mexican border. Before leaving, Lawson sought out Sarah privately. "Winter will be hard," she said. "Nalnish's group is good people, but small group, not many warriors. You will need to be strong, need to help however you can." "I'm trying to learn," Sarah replied, "but I'm not much use yet." Lawson smiled, the first time Sarah had seen her face soften. "You learn fast or you die. Apache way." She paused, studying Sarah's face. "But I think you learn fast. You have survivor spirit, like Apache woman." As they prepared to separate, Desba and one of the women from Lawson's band engaged in what was clearly a medical consultation. The two medicine women examined various herbs and powders, discussing treatments and sharing knowledge that had been accumulated over generations. When they finished, Lawson's companion presented Desbo with a small leather pouch that seemed to be greatly valued. Medicine for birthing, Nalnish explained to Sarah when she asked about the exchange. Ayana's time is coming soon, maybe before we reach winter camp. Grandmother now has what she needs to help when baby comes. The prospect of Ayana giving birth in the wilderness, possibly during a blizzard or while fleeing from soldiers, added another layer of urgency to their journey. Sarah watched the pregnant woman with new concern, noticing how she moved more slowly than before, and how she sometimes paused to rest her hand on her swollen belly. Their route south took them through increasingly desolate country, where water was scarce, and the landscape was dominated by harsh rock formations and sparse vegetation. The Apache seemed to know every hidden spring and sheltered canyon, but even with their expert knowledge, progress was difficult. On their third day after leaving Lawson's band, they encountered their first serious obstacle. Naiche, scouting ahead, returned with word that a large military column was camped directly across their intended route. The soldiers appeared to be conducting a systematic search of the area, setting up a network of camps that would make it nearly impossible for any Apache band to pass undetected. Too many soldiers, Chato said through Narlinch's translation. Maybe 200. Maybe more. Have Indian scouts with them can follow trail anywhere. This news sparked a lengthy discussion among the adults, conducted in rapid Apache that Sarah couldn't follow. She could tell from their expressions and gestures that they were weighing difficult alternatives, none of them attractive. Finally, Nalnish turned to her with a grave expression. Problem, he said. Cannot go around soldiers without adding many days to journey. But Ayana cannot ride hard for many days, and winter storms coming. Also, going around means going through Comanche territory, and Comanche not friendly to Apache right now. What about going back? Sarah asked. Back is no good either. More soldiers coming from north pushing all Apache bands south, like driving buffalo into corral for killing. The strategic situation was becoming clear to Sarah. The military was conducting a coordinated campaign designed to trap Apache bands between converging forces and either kill them or drive them onto reservations. Her group was caught in the middle of this net with fewer and fewer options for escape. So what do we do? She asked. Nalnish was quiet for a long moment. Only one choice, maybe. Try to go through soldiers at night. Hope they don't see us. Hope their Indian scouts don't find our trail. The plan they developed was simple but dangerous. They would wait until the darkest part of the night, then attempt to lead their horses through the gaps in the military picket lines. If they were discovered, they would scatter in different directions, with each person responsible for their own escape. What about Ayana? Sarah asked. She can't run if something goes wrong. Ayana knows the risk. Nalnish replied. She says better to try and maybe die than to give up and definitely die. As they waited for nightfall, Sarah found herself thinking about the choices that had led her to this moment. 6 weeks ago, she had been a settler's daughter living in a small cabin. Her greatest worry, the possibility of a poor harvest. Now she was preparing to sneak through army lines with a group of Apache warriors, knowing that capture would likely mean death for all of them. Yet, despite the danger, she found that she felt more alive than she had in years. Every decision mattered. Every skill she learned could mean the difference between life and death. Every relationship was stripped down to its essential elements of loyalty and trust. When darkness finally fell, they began their approach to the military lines. Sarah had been paired with Ayana, both to help the pregnant woman if she needed assistance, and to ensure that the two least experienced members of the group stayed together. They moved in single file, leading their horses rather than riding, placing each foot carefully to avoid making noise. The night was cloudy, which provided concealment but also made navigation more difficult. Sarah found herself relying entirely on Ayana's instincts and experience, following the Apache woman through terrain that seemed identical in all directions. Despite her pregnancy, Ayana moved with a grace and silence that Sarah could barely comprehend, seeming to flow around obstacles rather than push through them. They had been moving for about an hour when Sarah heard the sound that chilled her blood, the whinny of a horse from somewhere ahead of them. The sound was answered immediately by another horse, and then by a human voice calling out in English, "Sergeant!" Something spooked the horses in Sector 3. Instantly, their entire group froze in place. Sarah could see the dark shapes of her companions ahead and behind, all motionless as shadows. From their left came the sound of boots on rocky ground and the jingle of military equipment as guards moved to investigate the disturbance. For what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, they remained perfectly still while soldiers moved around them in the darkness. Sarah could hear voices, some close enough that she could make out individual words, as the guards searched for whatever had alarmed their horses. Probably just a coyote, one voice said, uncomfortably close to where Sarah crouched beside a large boulder. Or maybe a javelina looking for water. Maybe, replied another voice, but the captain said to check everything. Indians are supposed to be in this area. The casual way the soldiers discussed hunting down human beings as if they were dangerous animals made Sarah's stomach turn. She found herself thinking of Nalnish, of Desba's gentle hands treating her frostbitten feet, of Ayana's patient teaching and quiet strength. These were the hostiles the army was hunting with such determination. Eventually, the guards moved away, apparently satisfied that the disturbance had been caused by wildlife. That the close call had shaken everyone in the group, and they moved even more carefully as they continued their infiltration. It took them most of the night to work their way through the military cordon, but eventually they found themselves on the far side of the soldier lines, looking back at the scattered campfires that marked the positions they had successfully avoided. The sense of relief was overwhelming, but it was tempered by the knowledge that they had escaped one trap only to face an uncertain future in the harsh country ahead. Good work, Narlinch said quietly to Sarah as they remounted their horses. You learn Apache ways quickly. Over the following days, their journey took them into increasingly difficult terrain. The mountains here were higher and more rugged than anything Sarah had experienced, with narrow trails that wound between towering peaks and deep canyons that seemed to drop away into nothingness. The weather grew colder as they gained elevation, and snow began to fall with increasing frequency. It was during this difficult passage that Sarah finally began to feel like a contributing member of the group, rather than simply a burden to be protected. Her feet, healed now, except for the 2 toes she had lost to frostbite, allowed her to help with tasks that required mobility. She could gather firewood, fetch water, and assist with the countless small chores that kept the group functioning. More importantly, she had learned enough Apache to communicate directly with most of the group members, though her vocabulary remained limited to practical matters. This ability to speak with Ayana, Desba, and the others without relying on Nalnish's translation made her feel more integrated into the group's daily life. It also allowed her to better understand the dynamics and relationships within the group. She learned that Chato and Desba had been married for more than 40 years, and that 2 of the younger warriors were their sons. Easter and Nantan were sisters who had lost their husbands in the same battle, and who now shared the care of their combined children. Most surprisingly, she learned that Nolnish was not just another warrior in the band, but was actually Chato's chosen successor as leader. The old man was training him not just in combat and survival skills, but in the complex art of keeping a group of people alive and functioning under impossible circumstances. Why didn't you tell me? Sarah asked him when she learned this. Not important, Nalnish replied with his characteristic understatement. Title means nothing if people die. Better to just do work than talk about doing work. This revelation helped her understand why he had taken such personal responsibility for her welfare, and why the others had accepted her presence so readily. As future leader, Nalnish's decisions carried weight beyond his individual judgment. Their route continued to take them higher into the mountains, following ancient trails that had been used by Apache hunting parties for generations. The landscape was breathtakingly beautiful, but utterly unforgiving. With temperatures that plunged well below freezing at night, and winds that could knock a person from a narrow mountain path. It was on one of these high mountain trails that Ayana went into labor. Sarah had been riding beside her when the pregnant woman suddenly doubled over, gripping her horse's mane and letting out a sharp cry of pain. The contraction lasted for nearly a minute, during which Ayana's face went white with effort and strain. "Stop!" Sarah called out to the group. "The baby's coming." The response was immediate and organized. Desba quickly examined Ayana and confirmed that labor had indeed begun. Chato sent the younger warriors to scout for a suitable place to make camp, while the women began preparing for what would clearly be a difficult birth in challenging circumstances. They found shelter in a shallow cave about a mile further up the trail, barely large enough to accommodate the entire group, but offering protection from the wind and concealment from any observers in the valley below. While the men set up a defensive perimeter and tended to the horses, the women transformed the cave into a birthing chamber. Sarah found herself assigned to assist Desba, though she had no experience with childbirth and was terrified of making some crucial mistake. But the old medicine woman was patient and clear in her instructions, showing Sarah how to prepare hot water, arrange clean cloths, and organize the various herbs and medicines that would be needed. Ayana labored for hours, with contractions that came in waves of increasing intensity. Between contractions, she rested and even managed to smile reassuringly at Sarah, who was far more frightened than the woman actually giving birth. "Strong baby," Ayana said during one rest period. speaking in the mixture of Apache and English that had become their common language. Kicks like warrior already. As the birth progressed, Sarah began to understand why Apache women were renowned for their toughness and endurance. Ayana endured pain that would have broken many people, yet she remained focused and determined, working with Desba to bring her child safely into the world. When the baby finally came, it was with a rush that left Sarah dizzy with relief and amazement. The child was perfect, a little girl with a strong voice and dark hair like her mother's. Desba quickly cleaned and examined the newborn, pronouncing her healthy and strong. "Beautiful daughter," the old woman said to Ayana in English, one of the few phrases she had learned. "Good start for strong life." As Sarah held the baby while Desba tended to Ayana, she found herself overwhelmed by emotions she hadn't expected. This child, born in a cave while her people fled from soldiers who would kill her without hesitation, represented something precious and hopeful that transcended the violence and hatred that surrounded them. "What will you name her?" Sarah asked Ayana. The new mother thought for a moment, then smiled. "Bidzil," she said. "Means strong one in Apache. But also give her English name, for friend who helped bring her into world." She looked directly at Sarah. "Andar. Andar English name is Hope." The birth of baby Hope created a new set of challenges for the group. Ayana needed time to recover, but they couldn't remain in their exposed mountain position for long. Winter was approaching rapidly, and they still hadn't found a suitable location for their winter camp. Moreover, the baby's cries, no matter how well muffled, created a security risk that hadn't existed before. A crying infant could be heard for considerable distances in the thin mountain air, potentially revealing their location to any pursuit. "Have to find winter camp soon," Nalmish said to Sarah as they watched Ayana nursing her daughter by the dim light of their carefully concealed fire. "Cannot travel with baby when big storms come." "How much farther?" Sarah asked. 2 days, maybe 3, to place Chatto remembers from his youth. Hidden valley with warm springs, good shelter, but don't know if safe, don't know if anyone else there. The next morning, they resumed their journey with Ayana riding while carefully cradling her newborn daughter. The new mother was weak from the birth, but she insisted on traveling rather than remaining in their vulnerable position. Sarah rode beside her, ready to help if needed, and found herself becoming fiercely protective of both mother and child. Their destination proved to be everything Chatto had remembered, and more. The hidden valley was accessible only through a narrow canyon that could be easily defended, and it contained not only warm springs but also caves that would provide excellent winter shelter. Best of all, they found no signs of recent occupation, suggesting that they might be able to remain there undisturbed through the worst of the winter weather. As they set up what would be their home for the next several months, Sarah realized that she had traveled far beyond the physical distance from her family's destroyed cabin. She had entered a different world, one where survival depended on cooperation and mutual support, rather than individual achievement, where the measure of a person was their contribution to the group's welfare rather than their material possessions. Watching Ayana and baby Hope settling into their new home, surrounded by people who would protect them with their lives if necessary, Sarah understood that she had found something she hadn't even known she was looking for. She had found a family, one bound together, not by blood, but by shared experience and mutual loyalty. But even as they celebrated their arrival at what promised to be a safe winter refuge, Sarah knew that their challenges were far from over. Winter in the mountains would test their survival skills to the limit, and spring would bring renewed military campaigns designed to drive them from even this remote sanctuary. For now, though, they had shelter, water, and each other. In a world where those simple necessities had become precious beyond measure, it was enough. The hidden valley proved to be a sanctuary more complete than any of them had dared hope. As the first serious snows of winter began to fall, sealing them off from the outside world, Sarah discovered that isolation could be a blessing rather than a curse. For the first time since the destruction of her family's cabin, she could sleep through the night without listening for the sound of approaching horses or watching the horizon for signs of danger. The caves that would serve as their winter homes were spacious and dry, warmed by the geothermal springs that bubbled up from deep underground. The Apache had quickly and efficiently divided the available space, with families taking larger chambers and single individuals sharing smaller ones. Sarah found herself assigned to share a cave with Ayana and baby Hope, an arrangement that suited everyone involved. Caring for the newborn created a natural bond between the two women that transcended their cultural differences. Baby Hope was a good-natured infant who slept well and fed enthusiastically, but she still required constant attention. Sarah found herself taking night shifts to allow Ayana to rest, walking the baby around the warm caves when she was fussy, and learning to change the moss and hide diapers that Apache mothers used. "You are good with her," Ayana said one evening, as they watched the baby sleeping peacefully between them. "Will make good mother yourself someday." The comment caught Sarah by surprise. At 22, she had been approaching the age where most women in her community were considered spinsters if they remained unmarried. But the destruction of her old life had also destroyed those expectations, leaving her free to imagine futures that would have been impossible before. "I never thought much about having children," Sarah replied. "In my old life, it seemed like something that happened to other people." "Apache women choose their own path," Ayana said. "Some have many children, some have few. Some choose to be warriors instead of mothers. All paths have honor if walked with courage." The winter routine that developed in their valley was unlike anything Sarah had experienced. Without the constant pressure of travel and the need to avoid detection, the group was able to focus on the quieter activities of survival and community building. Days were spent in practical work, repairing equipment, preparing hides, making clothing, and maintaining their weapons. Evenings were devoted to storytelling, teaching, and the complex social activities that kept a small group functioning harmoniously through months of close confinement. Sarah quickly discovered that Apache education was vastly different from the formal schooling she had received as a child. Learning happened constantly and organically, with every activity serving as an opportunity to pass on essential knowledge. While working on tanning a deer hide, Ista would teach her about the properties of different plants used in the process. While helping Desba prepare medicines, she learned not just which herbs had healing properties, but how to identify them in different seasons and environments. Most importantly, she began to understand the spiritual and philosophical framework that guided Apache life. This education came not through formal instruction, but through observation and gradual inclusion in rituals and ceremonies that marked important events and seasonal changes. The first of these ceremonies occurred about a month after their arrival in the valley, when Chatto decided it was time to formally welcome baby Hope into the community. Sarah was invited to participate, though she wasn't entirely sure what her role should be. The ceremony took place in the largest of their caves, with a fire built from specially selected woods that filled the space with aromatic smoke. Chatto, wearing his finest clothes and carrying a staff decorated with eagle feathers, spoke for a long time in Apache, while the assembled group listened respectfully. Nalnish quietly translated for Sarah. He says the baby comes to us in a time of great change and danger, but also in a place of safety and hope. He says she will grow up knowing both the old ways and the new ways, and will help her people find their path in a changing world. When Chatto finished speaking, each member of the group came forward to offer gifts and blessings for the baby. Some gifts were practical items that would be useful as Hope grew. Tiny moccasins, miniature tools, small clothes made from the softest deer skin. Others were symbolic, a small piece of turquoise for protection, a tiny bow made from flexible wood, a doll carved from mountain cedar. When it came to Sarah's turn, she felt uncertain and awkward. She had no special skills in Apache craftsmanship, no sacred objects to offer, no traditional blessings to speak. But Ayana had anticipated this difficulty, and she stepped forward to stand beside Sarah as she approached the baby. "My friend gives gift of protection," Ayana announced. "She promises to help watch over daughter, to teach her white people's ways so she can walk safely in both worlds." The commitment surprised Sarah, as she hadn't been consulted about it beforehand. But as she looked down at baby Hope, sleeping peacefully despite the ceremony taking place around her, she realized that she wanted to make exactly that promise. This child represented something precious and vulnerable that deserved protection regardless of the political conflicts raging outside their valley. "I promise," Sarah said, first in English and then in her halting Apache. "I will help protect her and teach her, and I will be her friend always." The ceremony concluded with singing and drumming that continued late into the night. Sarah found herself included naturally in the celebration, though she was still learning the songs and rhythms. What struck her most forcefully was the sense of continuity represented by the event. Despite everything that had been taken from them, the Apache were determined to maintain their traditions and pass them on to the next generation. As winter deepened and the snows piled higher around their valley, Sarah began to understand why the Apache had survived for centuries in this harsh landscape. Their knowledge was incredibly detailed and practical, covering everything from weather prediction to food preservation to the complex social arrangements needed to keep a group functioning under stress. She learned to recognize the subtle signs that indicated changes in weather patterns, knowledge that could mean the difference between life and death for people living without permanent shelter. She discovered that many plants remained edible and nutritious even in winter, if you knew where to look and how to prepare them. Most importantly, she began to understand the Apache approach to conflict resolution and decision-making, which emphasized consensus and mutual respect rather than rigid hierarchy. This last lesson proved particularly valuable when tensions began to develop within their small community. After months of close confinement, personality conflicts and disagreements over resource allocation began to create stress that threatened the group's harmony. The conflict came to a head over the question of rationing their meat supplies. The hunting had been poor due to heavy snows, and it became clear that they would need to carefully manage their remaining food if they were to avoid starvation before spring. Some members of the group advocated for strict equal rationing, while others argued that pregnant and nursing mothers, growing children, and the elderly should receive larger shares. In Sarah's old community, such a dispute would likely have been resolved by the authority of a single leader, probably the oldest man or whoever owned the most property. But the Apache approach was very different. Chato called for a council meeting in which every adult member of the group was expected to participate and express their views. The discussion that followed was lengthy and sometimes heated, but it was conducted with a respect for different viewpoints that impressed Sarah. Each person was allowed to speak without interruption, and even the most passionate advocates for different approaches listened carefully to opposing arguments. Sarah found herself in the unusual position of being asked for her opinion despite being the newest and least experienced member of the group. What do white people do in such situations? Chato asked through Nalinish's translation. Usually the strongest person takes what they want and the weak go hungry, Sarah replied honestly. But that doesn't seem right to me. Her answer prompted a murmur of interest from the group, and several people asked follow-up questions about white society that made Sarah realize how little she had actually understood about her own culture's assumptions and values. The eventual solution was characteristically Apache in its emphasis on community responsibility. Rather than implementing rigid rationing, they decided that everyone would contribute to hunting and food-gathering activities according to their abilities and that distribution would be based on need rather than contribution. The elderly and very young would receive priority, but no one would go hungry as long as anyone had food to share. This is why Apache survive, Nalnish explained to Sarah later. Not because we are stronger fighters or better hunters than other people, but because we take care of each other. When everyone in group is healthy and strong, group can survive anything. The arrangement worked well through the remainder of winter, though there were times when everyone went to bed hungry. Sarah found herself participating fully in the communal work efforts, joining hunting parties when the weather permitted, and contributing her growing skills in plant identification and food preparation. It was during one of these hunting expeditions that she had her first serious encounter with a potential enemy since joining the Apache. She had been assigned to work with Casa in checking a series of snares they had set for rabbits and other small game in a canyon about 2 miles from their main camp. They had been successful in their hunting, collecting 3 rabbits and a ground squirrel from their traps, when Casa suddenly froze and gestured for silence. Following his gaze, Sarah saw what had alarmed him. Fresh horse tracks in the snow, too recent to have been left by anyone in their group. The tracks appeared to have been made by 3 or 4 horses, traveling together and moving with purpose rather than wandering randomly. Most troubling, the direction of travel suggested that the riders were heading toward the hidden entrance to their valley. Casa immediately began covering their own tracks and gathering up their snares, working with swift efficiency to eliminate any sign of their presence in the area. Sarah helped as best she could, though she felt clumsy and slow compared to his practiced movements. "Who do you think it is?" she whispered as they prepared to return to camp. "Don't know," Casa replied quietly. "Maybe Apache from other band, looking for winter shelter. Maybe white men, hunters, or prospectors. Maybe soldiers, though soldiers usually travel in larger groups." They made their way back to camp by a circuitous route, taking care to approach from a direction that would not reveal the location of the hidden entrance. When they arrived, Kasara immediately reported his discovery to Chato and Nalnish, sparking an intense discussion among the group's leaders. The decision was made to post additional guards and to prepare for possible evacuation if the strangers proved hostile. Sarah found herself assigned to help pack essential supplies and to assist Ayana in preparing baby Hope for potential travel. "Are we going to have to run again?" Sarah asked, as they bundled the baby in warm furs. "Maybe," Ayana replied calmly. "Apache, always ready to run, always ready to fight, always ready to hide. Is way we survive when stronger enemies try to destroy us." The tension lasted for 2 days, during which scouts reported that the mysterious riders were indeed searching the area systematically. They had camped in the main canyon and were apparently exploring every side passage and potential hiding place. It was Naiche who finally identified the intruders and solved the mystery. Scouting at dawn on the third day, he was able to get close enough to observe their camp and listen to their conversations. "White men," he reported to the assembled group. 3 of them, with pack animals. Not soldiers, not hunters. Looking for something specific, asking each other about landmarks and directions. "What kind of white men?" Nalnish asked. "Hard to say. Well armed, good equipment, but not military. One of them has map, keeps looking at it and pointing at different places." The description worried Chato, who had encountered similar groups before. "Could be bounty hunters," he said through translation. "Government pays money for Apache scalps, and some white men make living hunting Indians for reward. If the strangers were indeed bounty hunters, their presence represented a deadly threat to everyone in the valley. Such men were typically experienced fighters who knew Apache tactics and were motivated by substantial financial rewards." The debate over how to respond revealed different philosophies within the group. Some favored immediate evacuation, reasoning that their hidden location was their greatest asset and shouldn't be risked even if the strangers departed without finding them. Others argued for a more aggressive approach, suggesting that they should eliminate the threat permanently rather than constantly fleeing. It was Sarah who proposed the solution that was eventually adopted, though she did so hesitantly and with little confidence in her own judgment. "What if someone went to them openly?" she suggested. "A white woman traveling alone, maybe with a story about being lost or separated from a wagon train. I could get close enough to find out what they really want without revealing the location of our camp." The proposal shocked everyone, including Sarah herself. She had spoken almost without thinking, motivated by a desire to protect the people who had become her family. But as the implications of what she was suggesting sank in, she realized that she was proposing to risk her life in a way that could easily backfire and endanger everyone. "Too dangerous," Nolnish said immediately. "If they are bounty hunters, they might take you as prisoner or hostage. If they are something worse, you could be killed." "But if I don't try, we might all have to abandon our winter camp," Sarah replied. "And Ayana and the baby can't travel safely in this weather." The discussion that followed was intense and emotional. Some members of the group were touched by Sarah's willingness to take such a risk for their safety, while others were horrified by the prospect of sending anyone into such obvious danger. Eventually, it was Chato who made the decision. "Woman makes good plan," he said through Nalnish.